Roger Lerseth got his assignment in the spring of 1967 and told his squadron mates it looked like someone had bolted wings onto a bathtub. He'd been flying the F-8 Crusader, a gorgeous, fast, mean-looking fighter that naval aviators loved the way cavalrymen loved their horses. The A-7 Corsair II was none of those things. It was stubby, it was subsonic, it had a single engine and a face like a catfish. Lerseth, like most of the Navy pilots transitioning into the new airframe that year, figured someone in procurement had lost their mind. The Crusader was a dogfighter. The A-7 couldn't dogfight its way out of a paper bag. What it could do, what nobody yet appreciated, was take a beating that would have killed any other jet in the inventory and fly home anyway. The numbers on this aircraft are difficult to argue with. Over the course of the Vietnam War, the A-7 Corsair II posted the lowest loss rate per sortie of any tactical aircraft the United States flew in combat. The F-4 Phantom lost more. So did the A-6 Intruder, which cost twice as much, and the F-105 Thunderchief, which was being shot down at a rate that bordered on criminal. The A-7 flew deep into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, Route Package 6, the Ring of Steel around Hanoi, and came back at a rate that made statisticians at the Naval Air Systems Command double-check their data. Between 1967 and 1973, the Navy lost 55 A-7s in combat. That sounds like a lot until you look at the sortie count. The A-7 flew over 98,000 combat sorties in Southeast Asia. Do the math on that, and you get a loss rate so low, it sits in a category almost by itself. A post-war naval aviation analysis described the aircraft's survivability as exceeding all projections by a significant margin. Their word, significant. In Pentagon language, that's practically an exclamation point. And yet the jet remained unloved for most of its early life. Pilots didn't request it. They got assigned to it, usually with a grimace. The A-7 was born from a 1963 Navy requirement for a light attack aircraft that could haul bombs accurately without costing a fortune. And Ling Temco Vout won the contract by essentially redesigning the F-8 Crusader airframe into something slower, fatter, and more useful. The resemblance was intentional, but insulting, like turning a sports car into a delivery van. LTV kept the Crusader's basic fuselage shape, widened it, shortened it, removed the variable incidence wing that made the F-8 so nimble, and replaced the afterburning engine with a non-afterburning Pratt & Whitney TF-30 turbofan. The result was an airplane that topped out around 600 knots at sea level and couldn't break Mach 1 on its best day. In an era when speed was everything, when fighter jocks measured their worth in Mach numbers, the A-7 was an embarrassment on paper. Everything about it felt off. The look, the handling, the sheer indignity of flying something that slow. Pilots who'd been trained to go fast and pull hard suddenly found themselves strapped into a machine that prioritized something else entirely. If the A-7 had been designed 6 years earlier, it might have been a career ender for anyone who flew it. But Vietnam wasn't the war the Navy had planned for. It was the war where getting the bombs on target and getting home alive mattered more than anything on the spec sheet. The A-7 did both better than anyone expected. The expendability was the whole point. In 1963, the Navy was burning through A-4 Skyhawks over Southeast Asia at a pace that worried budget analysts more than admirals. The Skyhawk was small, cheap, brave, and absurdly overloaded. A 15,000-pound airplane carrying 8,000 pounds of bombs into AAA. Pilots loved it. The accountants loved it too, because when one didn't come back, replacing it didn't require a congressional hearing. But the A-4 had a problem the Navy couldn't ignore forever. It dropped bombs the old-fashioned way, by eyeball and feel, by the pilot's best guess, corrected for wind and dive angle, and the fact that the gun sight was designed in the 1950s. Missed distances were measured in hundreds of feet. Against a bridge or a power plant, Hundreds of feet meant you had to go back tomorrow and try again. Going back tomorrow meant flying through the same guns that almost killed you today. The requirement that became the A-7 asked for something specific. An aircraft that could carry the Skyhawk's bomb load, fly the Skyhawk's mission profile, cost no more than the Skyhawk to produce, and hit the target the first time. That last part was the revolution, though nobody called it that. The Navy wanted a computerized weapons delivery system integrated into a cheap airframe. Not a sophisticated all-weather bomber like the A-6 Intruder, which cost $6 million a copy. Something around $2 million. A truck with a brain. LTV's proposal arrived with a 17-month timeline from contract to first flight. A 6-month slip would have killed the whole thing. The A-7 would have missed its combat debut window, and the Navy might have doubled down on more A-4s instead. LTV hit the deadline. Anyway, the airframe they built around that requirement borrowed roughly 27% of its parts from the existing F-8 Crusader, landing gear, some hydraulics, portions of the tail section. Everything else was new. The fuselage was shorter by almost 4 feet and wider through the midsection to accommodate an internal weapons bay that was later deleted in favor of more fuel. The air intake was redesigned into that distinctive open mouth that gave the jet its unfortunate profile. And buried behind the cockpit instrument panel sat the thing that actually mattered. An AN/ASN 91 navigation and weapons delivery computer coupled to a continuous solution bombing system that could calculate release points in real time. The A-7 cockpit always smelled like hot avionics and hydraulic fluid, a sharp metallic tang that never fully went away no matter how long the canopy stayed open on the flight deck. For a $2.1 million airplane, it carried targeting technology that belonged in something 3 times its price. The Pentagon had asked for expendable. What LTV delivered was an airplane too good at its job to throw away. 47 days. That's how long the Air Force fought the directive before giving up. In 1965, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, a man who believed in commonality, the way evangelists believe in salvation, ordered the Air Force to adopt the Navy's A-7 as its new light attack aircraft. The Air Force response was roughly equivalent to being told to wear someone else's underwear. The resistance ran deep, and it ran personal. The Air Force had its own light attack candidate in development, a modified version of the Northrop F-5 that Tactical Air Command preferred for reasons that had almost nothing to do with capability and everything to do with pride. The Air Force had not adopted a Navy combat aircraft since 1950. 15 years of institutional independence had built walls that McNamara's cost-efficiency spreadsheets couldn't see. Generals at TAC headquarters made their objections formal, then informal, then borderline insubordinate. One internal memo since declassified referred to the A-7 adoption as an unwarranted imposition of naval design philosophy on Air Force tactical doctrine. Bureaucratic language for, "We don't want their ugly airplane." McNamara didn't care. His numbers showed that a common airframe across 2 services would save $578 million over the projected production run. He had the authority to make it happen, and by late 1965, the Air Force was writing requirements for what would become the A-7D, their version of the Corsair, modified with an Allison TF-41 engine that replaced the Navy's Pratt & Whitney TF-30 and boosted thrust by nearly 30%. The Air Force also demanded a 20mm M61 Vulcan cannon, where the Navy version carried 2 single-barrel 20mm guns. If they were going to fly a Navy jet, they were going to make it an Air Force jet first. The engine swap alone transformed the aircraft. The TF-41 gave the A-7D a thrust-to-weight ratio that let it operate from short, damaged runways in a European war scenario. Exactly the kind of mission TAC planners cared about. and Navy planners didn't. The first A-7D rolled off the line in April 1968. By then, the Air Force pilots assigned to fly it had already heard every joke the Navy guys could come up with about hand-me-downs. What none of them knew yet was that the Air Force variant would end up being the better airplane. The engine McNamara's people forced into the competition changed everything about how the Corsair performed at low altitude, and low altitude was where this war was being fought. The A-7D's bombing computer made every other tactical aircraft in the American inventory obsolete overnight. That's not hyperbole. Before the A-7D arrived in Southeast Asia, the average circular error probable for a dive bombing pass in combat conditions was somewhere between 200 and 400 feet. The A-7D cut that number to under 30. The difference between those two figures is the difference between cratering an empty rice paddy and dropping a bridge span into a river. The system responsible was designated the AN/ASN-91, and calling it a bombing computer undersells what it actually did. It was an integrated navigation and weapons delivery suite that continuously calculated the aircraft's position, velocity, wind drift, bomb ballistics, and release point, all simultaneously and in real time, without the pilot doing math in his head while anti-aircraft fire came up at him in bright orange streams. Previous attack aircraft required the pilot to set up a specific dive angle, hold a specific airspeed, pickle the bombs at a specific altitude, and hope that the dozen variables he couldn't control didn't push the impact point into a schoolyard. The A-7D pilot pointed the aircraft in the general direction of the target and let the computer tell him when to release. The system even compensated for the pilot's reaction time. A post-deployment assessment from the 354th Tactical Fighter Wing noted that first-pass accuracy rates with the A-7D exceeded 80% in combat conditions, a figure so far above the existing baseline that some analysts at 7th Air Force Headquarters initially questioned whether the data had been recorded correctly. It had been. The heart of the system was a Doppler radar feeding ground speed data into the navigation computer, cross-referenced with an integrated inertial measurement unit. Together, these gave the A-7D something no previous light attack jet possessed: the ability to know precisely where it was at all times, without relying on external navigation aids that the North Vietnamese could jam or that simply didn't exist over Laos and Cambodia. An F-105 pilot navigating over the Ho Chi Minh Trail at night was essentially following a map with a flashlight. An A-7D pilot had a computer telling him his position to within a few hundred meters. If the North Vietnamese had understood how much of an advantage that gave American strike planners, they might have prioritized killing A-7Ds over the faster, flashier F-4s that drew most of the SAM launches. They didn't, and that blind spot cost them. There's a detail in the maintenance records that has nothing to do with bombing accuracy, but says something about the aircraft anyway. The AN/ASN-91's cooling system required a dedicated air cycle machine that weighed 47 pounds and failed constantly in the humidity of carrier operations. Maintenance crews in the Gulf of Tonkin replaced these units so often they started keeping spares pre-wired on the hangar deck. Interesting, but irrelevant to the combat record. What mattered was what happened when the A-7D went north. On October 12, 1972, a flight of 4 A-7Ds from the 354th TFW struck the Lang Met Railroad Bridge in North Vietnam during Operation Linebacker. The bridge had been targeted 14 times previously by F-105s and F-4s. It was still standing. The 4 A-7Ds dropped 16 Mark 83,000-pound bombs using the AN/ASN-91's continuously computed impact point mode. The flight leader, Major Colin Clark, later described the bomb pattern as looking like someone had laid them in with a ruler. 2 spans dropped into the river. The bridge stayed down. 14 missions across 5 years with faster, more expensive aircraft had failed to do what 4 A-70s did in a single pass. The implications rippled backward through every assumption the Air Force held about tactical air power. Speed hadn't been the problem, and neither had bomb tonnage. The problem had been putting the bombs where they needed to go, and a $2 million computer stuffed inside a $3.5 million airplane that couldn't outrun a MiG if its life depended on it was what solved it. The A-7D traded speed for precision, and the trade paid off at a ratio that rewrote the planning models. Where an F-105 strike package needed 12 aircraft to guarantee destruction of a point target, the A-7D needed 4. Fewer aircraft meant fewer pilots exposed to ground fire, which meant fewer losses, which meant the Air Force could sustain operations longer without rotating depleted squadrons home. The math was brutal and simple, and it favored the ugly jet from Dallas over everything else on the ramp. The operations officer at Korat Royal Thai Air Base pulled the first mission brief together on October 16, 1972, and told the assembled pilots of the 354th TFW. Something that stuck with several of them for decades. If the airplane works half as well as the test data says, we're going to make a lot of people back home look very stupid. He meant the generals at TAGS, who'd spent 7 years trying to kill the program. He also meant it as a challenge. The 354th had arrived in theater 12 days earlier with 72 A-7Ds, a ground crew that had trained on the aircraft for less than a year, and orders to fly interdiction missions over the Ho Chi Minh Trail and into the route pack system over North Vietnam. There was no shakedown period, no gradual ramp-up, just straight into the most heavily defended airspace on the planet. The first combat sortie launched before dawn on October 16th. A two-ship element, led by Captain Jim Grubb, headed south toward Steel Tiger, the operational zone covering the Laotian Panhandle, where the trail's supply arteries ran thickest. Their target was a truck park identified by overnight reconnaissance, 14 vehicles clustered under tree canopy near the Ban Karai Pass. Grubb's wingman was a lieutenant, whose name doesn't appear in the after-action summary, only his call sign, Sandy 2. The weather was marginal. Cloud bases sat around 4,500 feet, which compressed the attack geometry into a narrow band where the A-7Ds had to fly low enough for the bombing computer to function accurately, but high enough to clear the karst ridgelines that jutted out of the jungle like broken teeth. Grubb rolled in first. He released 6 Mark 82 500-pound bombs in a single pass, using the continuously computed impact point mode, pulled 4 Gs on the recovery, and watched the detonations walk directly through the center of the truck park. Sandy 2 followed 15 seconds later and put his ordnance on the southern exit road. Post-strike reconnaissance confirmed 11 vehicles destroyed. The 2 A-7Ds had expended 12 bombs total. An F-105 strike on the same type of target typically required 8 aircraft carrying 24 bombs to achieve comparable results. The trail missions were dangerous, but survivable. Route Pack 6 would test whether the airplane could survive a threat environment that had chewed apart entire squadrons of faster, more agile aircraft. On November 7, 1972, the 354th sent its first A-7Ds north into Route Pack 6, the Hanoi-Haiphong corridor, where SA-2 guideline batteries, MiG-21 interceptors, and the densest concentration of anti-aircraft artillery in military history waited for anything that flew below 15,000 feet. The A-7D flew below 15,000 feet. That was where it lived. Captain Howard Holman led a 4-ship element tasked with suppressing a SAM site near Kep Airfield so that F-4 Phantoms could strike the rail yard beyond it. Holman's flight carried CBU-24 cluster munitions, canisters that split open at altitude, and scattered 665 baseball-sized bomblets across an area the size of 2 football fields. The SAM site had 57mm guns ringing its perimeter. Holman could see the muzzle flashes from 8 miles out, winking orange against the gray overcast, like someone flicking a cigarette lighter. His flight dove through it. The lead pair hit the SAM radar van and 2 of the 3 launcher rails. Holman took a 37mm fragment through his left wing root that severed a hydraulic line and sprayed fluid across the underside of the fuselage. He maintained control. The A-7D's redundant hydraulic system, a feature the original Navy requirement had specified precisely because the Skyhawk lacked it, kept the flight controls responsive on the backup circuit. Holman flew 340 miles back to Korat on that backup system, landed without incident, and was airborne again the next morning. 18 inches further inboard, that 37mm round would have struck the engine compressor section, and the TF-41 had no redundancy. The round went where it went. The 354th flew 4,277 combat sorties between October 1972 and the ceasefire on January 28, 1973. They lost 4 aircraft. 4. The F-105 wings that had flown the same routes over the same targets in earlier years lost aircraft at roughly 10 times that rate per sortie. The ugly jet from Dallas was proving the operations officer right, and the people back home were indeed looking very stupid. 36 hours before Christmas, 1972, the order came down to put every flyable A-7D over Hanoi. Linebacker 2 was different from anything that preceded it. President Nixon had authorized unrestricted B-52 strikes against targets in the Hanoi Haiphong complex, strategic bombing, on a scale not seen since 1945. The B-52s would fly at high altitude in predictable streams. The North Vietnamese knew this. They had roughly 1,000 SA-2 missiles stockpiled around the capital, and they intended to use every one. The A-7D's job was to make sure those missiles never left the rails. On the night of December 18th, the first wave of B-52s crossed into Route Pack 6 at 8 p.m. 40 minutes earlier, a 7Ds from the 354th had gone in at treetop level to hit the SAM sites ringing Hanoi from the northwest. Captain Mike Moffat's 4-ship element drew the Bac Mai complex, 6 SA-2 launchers defended by overlapping rings of 37mm and 57mm guns, all radar-directed, all firing before his flight crossed the Red River. The smell of cordite seeped into Moffat's cockpit through the environmental system at low altitude, a detail he mentioned afterward with something between disgust and disbelief. His element dropped CBU-58 cluster munitions across 4 of the 6 launcher positions in a single pass. 2 launchers survived. Those 2 fired 6 missiles at the B-52 stream that night. The other 4 fired nothing. Had those 4 sites remained active, the mathematics of the first night changed considerably. Each launcher could ripple fire 2 SA-2s per minute. Anyway, the 354th flew 126 sorties during Linebacker 2's 11 days. Their losses during those missions were 0. The B-52 force lost 15 aircraft and 33 crewmen killed, losses that might have been catastrophically higher without the SAM suppression campaign. The A-7Ds ran ahead of every wave. The North Vietnamese expended an estimated 884 SA-2 missiles during the operation. Roughly a third malfunctioned or went ballistic without guidance, and a significant portion of the remainder were fired from degraded sites that the A-7Ds had already hit once or twice. The SA-2 crews were brave. They kept reloading, kept firing from cratered positions with half their radar equipment shattered. But they were shooting at B-52s 7 miles up, while A-7Ds came back every few hours to tear apart whatever they'd managed to repair. By December 29th, Hanoi's missile inventory was functionally exhausted. The North Vietnamese returned to the negotiating table in Paris on January 8th. The ceasefire took effect 20 days later. The maintenance log for A-7D tail number 7, O-0955, lists its final entry on November 21, 1972. At 2:14 p.m. local time, engine run-up normal, All systems nominal, weapons loaded, fuel full. The aircraft never came back to generate a second entry. The A-7D's overall loss rate in Southeast Asia stands at 6 aircraft lost in combat across 12,928 sorties. That works out to a loss rate of 0.046% per sortie, the lowest of any tactical aircraft that flew in the Vietnam War. Lower than the F-4 Phantom, lower than the A-6 Intruder with its own sophisticated bombing computer and 2-man crew to operate it. Lower, in fact, than every fighter, attack jet, and reconnaissance platform the United States sent into that airspace. Look at the numbers, and the question isn't why the A-7D lost 6. The question is how it managed to lose only 6. Each loss tells a specific story. Tale number 7. O-955 went down over the trail when a 23mm round from a ZSU-23-4 mobile gun system struck the TF-41's accessory gearbox. The engine seized in under 8 seconds. Captain Dennis Haney ejected at 400 feet above the jungle canopy, broke his collarbone on the seat separation, and was rescued by a Jolly Green helicopter 90 minutes later. The second loss came on December 2nd. A direct SA-2 hit at 8,000 feet during a Route Pack 4 mission. No ejection observed. The pilot was First Lieutenant Stephen Musselman, 24 years old, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He died at 11:47 a.m., 460 miles from his base, on his 23rd combat sortie. The third aircraft took catastrophic damage from a barrage-fused 85mm shell that detonated close enough to shred the entire tail section. The pilot ejected and became a prisoner of war for 57 days before the ceasefire brought him home. The fourth was lost to unknown causes. The wingman reported seeing the aircraft descend into a cloud layer over Steel Tiger and never emerge. No emergency call, no beacon. The fifth took a 37mm hit to the fuel cell that ignited a fire the pilot couldn't extinguish. He nursed the burning aircraft east for 11 minutes before the controls stopped responding, and he punched out over the Mekong. The sixth went down on January 17, 1973, 11 days before the ceasefire, when multiple small arms hits severed the flight control linkages during a low-level pass over a supply depot near Mujia Pass. Of the 6 pilots, 4 survived. 2 did not. Stephen Musselman and the pilot lost over Steel Tiger never came home. What the losses reveal is as important as the losses themselves. 5 of the 6 were caused by direct structural damage that no aircraft design could have survived. A seized engine at 400 feet, a direct SAM hit, a destroyed tail section, severed flight controls, and uncontrollable fuel fire. Only the Steel Tiger loss remains unexplained. The A-7D wasn't surviving because pilots were lucky. It was surviving because the airframe absorbed enormous punishment in the zones that mattered. The redundant hydraulics, the self-sealing fuel cells, the armored cockpit tub, the engine placement high and tight against the fuselage where ground fire had the smallest possible target profile. Every one of those design choices paid dividends, measured in pilots who came home instead of becoming statistics on a briefing slide. The F-105 Thunderchief, flying comparable missions over the same target sets in earlier years, lost 334 aircraft in approximately 20,000 combat sorties. That's a loss rate of 1.67% per sortie, roughly 36 times higher than the A-7Ds. The F-105 was faster by 400 knots at sea level. It could carry more ordnance. It looked like a proper fighter. None of that kept it alive. Musselman's personal effects were returned to his family in March 1973. Among them was a letter he'd written to his younger brother the week before he was killed, describing the A-7D as the best airplane he'd ever flown and the ugliest thing he'd ever sat in. His squadron mates at the 354th added his name to the memorial board in the ready room at Korat. When the base reverted to Thai control in 1976, The board was packed into a crate and shipped to Myrtle Beach Air Force Base in South Carolina, where the 354th relocated. The crate arrived. The board inside was undamaged. Who dropped the last American bomb of the Vietnam War? The answer is buried in an operational summary from the 354th TFW that most histories of the conflict don't bother to cite. The ceasefire of January 28, 1973, ended the air war over North Vietnam, but it did not end the air war over Cambodia. Nixon had authorized continued bombing of Khmer Rouge positions and North Vietnamese supply routes running through Cambodian territory, and that campaign ground on for another 7 months, while Congress fought the White House over the legal authority to keep it going. The A-7Ds at Korat kept flying. The war was supposedly over. The missions weren't. By August 1973, the 354th had been running Cambodian sorties for so long that the pilots had started calling them the Forgotten War inside the Forgotten War. Congress had passed the Case Church Amendment prohibiting all further U.S. military action in Southeast Asia, effective midnight on August 15th. The clock was running. Every pilot at Korat knew the exact hour their war would end, not because of a military objective achieved, not because of a negotiated settlement, but because a legislative deadline said so. On the morning of August 15th, the 354th launched its final strike package. A 4-ship element of A-7Ds headed for a supply concentration near Bavay, just across the Vietnamese border in Cambodia's Svay Rieng province. The flight lead was Captain Lonnie Ratley. His target coordinates placed the depot roughly 40 miles from Phnom Penh in flat, featureless terrain that offered no terrain masking and no place to hide if something went wrong. The Khmer Rouge had 12.7 millimeter heavy machine guns scattered through the area, no SA-2s, no radar-guided 57 millimeter batteries, just men with heavy guns and a willingness to stand in the open and fire at jets. Ratley's element crossed the target at 10:30 a.m. The first 2 aircraft dropped their Mark 82s on the supply point. Ratley came in third and released on secondary storage positions along a tree line to the east. His wingman, the 4th aircraft, put the final bombs on a road junction 200 meters south of the main target. Those were the last American bombs to fall in the Indochina War. The whole thing, 8 years of Rolling Thunder, Linebacker, Arclight, Steel Tiger, Menu, Freedom Deal, all of it, ended with 500-pound bombs tumbling off the racks of an airplane that half the Air Force hadn't wanted and the other half couldn't pronounce correctly. The flight recovered to Korat at 11:52 a.m. The ground crews met them on the ramp, which was unusual. Normally, the pilots walked in alone. Ratley shut down his engine and sat in the cockpit for a long moment before climbing down. A photograph exists of him on the ladder, helmet under one arm, squinting into the Thai sun. He looks tired. The 354th's final tally for the entire Southeast Asian deployment: 12,928 combat sorties, 6 aircraft lost, over 22,000 tons of ordnance delivered. The wing received the Air Force Outstanding Unit Award. The citation praised the unit's extraordinary accuracy rates, which the bombing computer had made possible, and its unprecedented survivability, which the airframe had made possible. It did not mention that the airplane was ugly. The pilots had stopped mentioning it too. Korat's flight line went quiet in September 1973, but the A-7D did not retire to a comfortable peacetime obscurity. It went everywhere. The Air National Guard absorbed the bulk of the fleet starting in 1975, and this is where the airplane's story takes an unexpected turn. Guard units were traditionally where frontline aircraft went to die, weekend warriors flying hand-me-downs until the airframes cracked and the budgets ran out. The A-7D reversed that equation. Guard pilots, many of them Vietnam veterans who transitioned from the F-100 or F-105, discovered that the bombing computer and the TF-41 engine worked just as well over the Nellis Ranges as they had over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Guard A-70 units started winning the annual Gunsmoke bombing competition against active duty squadrons flying newer aircraft. They won it repeatedly. The 162nd Tactical Fighter Group out of Tucson became so dominant with the A-7D that active duty wings started sending observers to figure out what the Guard pilots were doing differently. The answer was nothing. The airplane was just that accurate in the hands of experienced pilots who flew it year after year instead of rotating to new assignments every 18 months. If the Air Force had kept the A-7D in frontline active service through the 1980s, the F-111's role in the 1986 Libya strikes might have looked very different. But that's speculation, not history. Grenada in 1983 saw Navy A-7Es fly close air support during Operation Urgent Fury, short-range work against light opposition, the kind of mission the Corsair could do half asleep. The more telling deployment came in 1989 during Operation Just Cause in Panama, where A-7Ds from the 175th Tactical Fighter Group, a Maryland Air National Guard unit based at Martin State Airport outside Baltimore, flew combat missions against Panamanian Defense Force positions. Guard pilots, combat missions. The A-7D was nearly 20 years old by then, and still the most precise delivery platform available for the mission profile. Then came the Gulf. On January 17, 1991, at 2:38 a.m. local time, two A-7Es from VA-72 aboard the USS John F. Kennedy launched HARM anti-radiation missiles at Iraqi early warning radar sites along the Saudi-Kuwait border. These were among the opening shots of Operation Desert Storm. The A-7Es went in ahead of the strike packages, exactly the way the A-7Ds had gone in ahead of the B-52s over Hanoi 18 years earlier, killing the radar, blinding the defenses, making the path safe for what followed. The pilots could feel the concussion of their own harms detonating through the airframe, even at standoff range, a deep thump that traveled up through the seat and into the spine. VA-72 and VA-46, both flying off the Kennedy, were the last two A-7 squadrons in the U.S. Navy. Their pilots knew this was the final combat deployment. The jets were scheduled for retirement immediately upon return. Every sortie they flew was both a combat mission and a farewell. VA-46 flew its last combat sortie on February 24th. VA-72 flew its last on February 25th, the day before the ceasefire. The squadron's operations log for that final mission is 4 pages long and reads like every other mission summary in the book. Target coordinates, ordnance expended, time on station, battle damage assessment. The entry ends with fuel state on recovery and a notation that all aircraft returned to the ship. The A-7Es were offloaded from the Kennedy at Norfolk in March 1991. Within 6 months, both squadrons had decommissioned. The airframes went to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, where they sit in rows on the desert hardpan to this day, canopies yellowing in the sun. A Vought engineer named Jim Swick, who'd worked on the A-7 from first metal cut through final delivery, told a colleague at a 1994 retirement dinner that every airplane the company ever built was a compromise. But the A-7 was the only one where they compromised on the right things. He was talking about looks. He was also talking about everything else. The F-35 Lightning II carries a bombing computer that is a direct evolutionary descendant of the AN/ASN-91 that flew in the A-7D. The lineage runs through the F-16's fire control system, which borrowed its core architecture from the Corsair's integrated weapons delivery suite because the engineers at General Dynamics had watched what that system did over the trail and decided they wanted the same capability in a faster airframe. The philosophy: one pilot, one engine, computerized precision, survivability through accuracy rather than speed, maps onto every light attack and multi-role platform the United States has fielded since 1972. The A-7 didn't just prove the concept worked, it proved the concept won wars. The North Vietnamese gunners who fired at A-7Ds over Route Pack 1 and the Trail were professional soldiers doing hard work under impossible conditions. American pilots who flew those missions said so repeatedly in debriefs. The 57mm crews in particular earned grudging respect. They adapted their tactics faster than any other element of the North Vietnamese air defense network, shifting from barrage fire to predicted fire to coordinated ambush patterns in a matter of weeks. They were losing, but they were learning. The ceasefire came before that learning curve could flatten the American advantage. Roger Lerseth, the F-8 pilot from Section 1, who thought the A-7 looked like a bathtub with wings, retired from the Navy in 1979 as a commander. He'd flown 214 combat missions in the A-7E. At his retirement ceremony, he said exactly one thing about the airplane. It brought him home every time he asked it to. The operational record for the A-7 Corsair II across all services and all conflicts reads as follows. Total production, 1,569 airframes, combat deployments, Vietnam, Cambodia, Grenada, Panama, Libya, Persian Gulf. Navy. A-7 variants flew over 98,000 combat sorties in Southeast Asia. Air Force A-7Ds flew 12,928. Combined combat losses across all variants in Vietnam, 55 aircraft. The A-7D's 6 losses in 12,928 sorties remain the lowest loss rate of any tactical aircraft in the war. 4 of those 6 pilots survived. Over 22,000 tons of ordnance delivered by the 354th TFW alone. The final combat sortie flown by an American A-7 took place on February 25, 1991, over Kuwait. The after-action report listed it as routine.